Professor Lee, I want to ask you next about some correspondence you had with Dr. Ritzer and some work you undertook with Dr. Ritzer in the course of 1983. If we have up on screen, just to put this in context, WITN 0644065. If we just zoom in a little bit on the text, please, Henry. So this is a letter from the Lancet, July the 16th, 1983, and it's authored by you and others at the Royal Free. And it talks about a study of 64 patients with haemophilia A. And as I understand it, this was the examination of the T cells in the way that you've referred to already, and consideration of whether fractionation methods were a cause. It's a somewhat crude summary, but is that right?
Yes.
And at this stage, the patients that you had looked at were all Royal Free Centre patients?
Yes.
Now, if we could then have on screen, please, OXUH 0002971_006. We can see this is a letter which you wrote to Dr. Ritzer in July of 1983. It refers to a telephone conversation the two of you had had, and then you set out in writing the plan. You talk about how the technician will receive specimens. You suggest it would be helpful if some serum could be stored for future use. And then you say in the concluding paragraph, I look forward to receiving the specimens. I think it will be a very valuable contribution to have these results in a population of patients treated with non-commercial factor VIII. Could you just explain what it was you were asking Dr. Ritzer to do and what the two of you had discussed?
I've already talked about this. Basically, that letter that you just put up, in our patients, we had found that patients treated with factor IX concentrate did not have abnormalities, but the patients treated with factor VIII concentrate did. And our speculation in that letter was that we thought it was the manufacturing process of the factor IX, and which is different to the factor VIII. But there remained the possibility that it might be something to do with the donor pool. And although we had all our patients with factor IX NHS concentrate, because they're a smaller number, they were all on NHS, our patients with factor VIII deficiency had a mixture of commercial and NHS. So what we wanted to do was to expand the population of patients with factor VIII deficiency who had NHS concentrate so that we could compare the two. Now, Oxford had a long tradition of making concentrates, and they had tended to keep more of their patients on the fractionation moved from Oxford to the fractionation plant later, but they had a tendency all the way through to keep more patients on NHS concentrate than we did. So the idea was to expand the number of patients with factor VIII deficiency who'd been treated exclusively with NHS product and to compare the two.
And so an arrangement was made between you and Dr. Ritzer that he would take samples of serum from his patients and those would be sent to the Royal Free and then tested in the Royal Free's laboratories. Is that right?
That's right. And the comment here, our technician here feels he can cope with 5 or 6 specimens. That was because the immunology laboratory, it was quite an intensive test to do. And I think they were sent by a car to the Royal Free because the other issue about these T4, T8 ratios was that it was important that the blood was tested as quickly as possible.
But before we look at the rest of your correspondence with, or some other bits of your correspondence with Dr. Ritzer, could we have on screen OXUH 0002245 underscore 007? Now, this is a letter not sent by or to you, Professor Lee. It's from Dr. Ritzer to the regional medical officer within his own health authority, and it's May 1983. You can see, if you look at the last sentence of the first paragraph, he's saying he thinks it's important to act quickly to set up screening tests to detect patients who might be at risk of developing the full-blown condition. And then he goes on in the next paragraph to talk about the fact that Oxford has many patients who've received only NHS factor 8, and says it should be possible to find out if patients on NHS concentrates are immunosuppressed to the same degree as those on US concentrates. So was the work that you and Dr. Ritzer were doing in any respect connected with what's identified here as the importance of screening tests to detect patients who might be at risk of developing AIDS, or was that something separate?
What was the date of this?
11th of May 1983.
I think it probably was to do with our tests.
Did you see the tests that you were doing in any respect as a means of detecting people who might be at risk of developing AIDS?
To the extent that we were considering whether the immunological changes were going to lead on to AIDS, yes. But we had this discussion before the break. It would be helpful, but we didn't really know for certain. And you know, we at that stage were still speculating whether it was the manufacture of the factor 9 that had made the ratios normal compared to the manufacture of factor 8. But clearly, and another possibility that was being considered then was whether it was the donor pool.
In terms of those patients where, and I'll just ask you here to deal solely with the Royal Free patients, not the Oxford patients. The Royal Free patients where you identified the immunological abnormalities, was that information, to your knowledge, shared with patients at the time?
I don't know. I think we certainly were, it was being done as a screening test so that we knew. We did a total lymphocyte count which demonstrated immunological damage, and you'd have a count less than 1,000. But it also, the T48 ratio allowed us to identify patients who were particularly at risk. And I can't remember whether we specifically said what the result of their T48 ratio was. I suppose because we didn't entirely know, but I can't remember.
Okay. And then if we go on to your correspondence with Dr. Ritzer to OXUH 0002972. This is a letter of the 3rd of October 1983, and it says, "Dear Dr. Ritzer, I'm setting out below our plan for the joint study which we discussed at Oxford and by telephone last week. The aims of the study are set out below: to establish the degree of immunological abnormality in a population of heavily treated haemophiliacs, treated exclusively with NHS concentrate, to confirm the differences in T subset distribution we found between patients with haemophilia A and haemophilia B." Pausing there, so that's the same study that the earlier letter also refers to. If we go down, we can see various blood specimens required. And then if you go over the page, please, Henry. Can I just ask you to look at the last paragraph? You say, "I hope this covers all the details and we look forward to the study becoming a reality. I hope you're not all worn out telephoning patients your end. If we manage to obtain this data, it should make a valuable contribution and perhaps even silence the Daily Mail. Just dealing first of all with the sentence in the middle of that paragraph, not all worn-out telephoning patients your end. What was that a reference to? Are you able to say?
I imagine he actually phoned patients to ask them to come in to have blood taken. I would imagine.
And then you say, if we manage to obtain this data, it should make a valuable contribution and perhaps even silence the Daily Mail. What was the reference to silencing the Daily Mail?
I can't remember what the particular headline was, but the Daily Mail was making really awful headlines about AIDS at this time. But I can't remember the specific headline. No, I can't remember.
You then, if we go on to OXUH 0002971_001, this is a letter from you to Dr. Ritzer, the 16th of November 1983. You refer in the first paragraph to results for a particular set of specimens, I think. Again, they're very normal. And then in the next paragraph, you say it's noticeable how normal your patients are, but apart from the problem of dose, younger patients seem to be normal in other studies. So we must be cautious and look at more patients before we can finally comment about NHS concentrate. And then you say this, I do have a nasty feeling that NHS concentrate is going to turn out safer. What was that nasty feeling? Can you explain that comment,
well,
please?
The nasty feeling was that I then realised that, or began to realise that we maybe have a large number of factor VIII deficient patients who have got this problem. That's what it's about.
The problem meaning the immunological abnormalities, or that you were realising that it was the donor pool and not fractionation methods?
Yes.
Yes,
that this would that the donor pool was the problem, rather than the fractionation process. And it was that realisation that was the nasty feeling, that we were going to have a large number of patients with illness. And the other issue about this is that one of the things about younger patients seem to be normal. Well, later on, we found that the normal CD4 count is 800, and early on we began to realise that actually children have higher counts than adults. So that's what that comment is about.
Could we then just look at the published article briefly? We've already looked at it this morning. WITN 0644064, please. So this is the article ultimately published in 1985, but we can see from the dates received on the 4th of June 1984, and co-authored, amongst others, by you and Dr. Ritzer. If we just go to the last page, please, Henry. Sorry, forgive me. Go 2 pages before that. If you see in the acknowledgements, we can see this study was supported by Action Research, the Medical Research Council, the Hemophilia Society, and the Armour Pharmaceutical Company. Supported by presumably means funded by. Is that right?
Yes.
And what was the particular interest of Armour in funding the study? Can you recall?
No.
We've looked at this already, but if we just go back to the first page. If we look in the summary, so that's the first paragraph, please, Henry, if we could zoom in on that. Just go down a bit. Thank you. So if we just look at the last sentence of the summary, fractionation procedures used to prepare clotting factor concentrates and the amounts of concentrate used are more likely to be causally related to these immunological abnormalities than the origins of source donor plasmas. I just wanted to ask you about that conclusion, Professor Lee, because you've explained in relation to the correspondence with Dr. Ritzer that the nasty feeling was because the NHS results, if I can put it in that abbreviated way, were coming back relatively normal, and you were beginning to sense that it was not fractionation methods, but the plasma pools that were the problem. But in an article submitted approximately 6 months later, the conclusion's still there that fractionation procedures are the likely cause. Why was that?
I think that must have been the predominant conclusion. At that time.
And are you able to assist us with what the basis was for the conclusion that it was these abnormalities that you were detecting were more likely to be due to the fractionation procedures than the donor pools?
Well, I think it was still going back to the. There was a question about factor 9. I can't remember the detail of this.
Can I ask you then next, just briefly, about what, if any, information may have been provided to patients about the risk of AIDS in 1983, 1984? Whose responsibility within the centre would it have been to provide information or advice to patients about the possible risk of AIDS at that time?
I think probably Dr. Kernoff. I can't actually remember, but I would imagine. The other thing that we had in the centre was people waited in a waiting area in the centre, and there was a wire basket with all sorts of information put in, and so you put the information from Hemophilia Society or anything that. And that would be one way of disseminating information, but I don't know.
Do you know, as a matter of fact, whether information or warnings about the risk of AIDS was provided to patients at the centre in 83 or 84?
No.
So you don't know?
I don't know.
Okay. Can you recall if whether in the regular meetings you've mentioned or otherwise, whether there were any discussions within the centre at that time on the issue of what information to provide to patients?
Did you say, do I remember?
Do you remember if there were any
No.
discussions? Okay. So you don't remember?
No.
Okay. It appears that there was some Dr. Kernoff contemplated some trials of heat-treated products in late 83. Just wanted to ask you to look at a couple of documents and see if it was something you had any involvement with. Henry, it's RFLT 00000019. So we can see this is an application to the Ethical Practices Subcommittee, I think, at the Royal Free. It's dated 1st of December and it's signed by Dr. Kernoff. And you'll see the subject of it is to assess whether heat-treated human factor VIII concentrate or PE fractionated porcine factor VIII concentrate are less likely to transmit hepatitis than routinely used human factor VIII concentrates. And then if we just skip over the next paragraph, in the paragraph beginning, a major effort is being made. Dr. Kernoff says, we've been offered 2 commercial heat-treated products for clinical assessment. Both have been granted clinical trials exemption. And he sets out what they were, Hemophil T and factor VIII heat-treated. Did you have any involvement with these trials?
No.
Do you know if they actually happened at the Royal Free?
I don't think the heat-treated trials took place, but what I do know is that there was a publication of porcine factor 8 that was published in Blood that was authored. I think you should probably ask Professor Tuddenham tomorrow. What I also know is that I doubt whether heat-treated factor 8 was used at this time, because quite clearly stated in one of these papers is that it says that heat-treated factor 8 was used in the late part of 84, I think. But I think the answer should be no.
Okay. Now, we know, and you've referred to it in your statement, that in December 1984, the Haemophilia Centre reference directors produced an AIDS advisory document. I'm not going to ask you to look at the details of that, but it contained recommendations for the use of heat-treated products. You were asked about what the Royal Free then did at the Lindsay Tribunal. I can take you to it if need be, but your evidence was that there was a phased introduction of heat-treated product over a 3 to 6 month period. So that would have been the first half of 1985. Can we take that as being your best evidence on that point, as it was given at Lindsay?
Yes, I think it's important to remember that I left the Royal Free in I'd started at the Queen Mary's and Charing Cross at the beginning of November. Sorry, did you say 83 or 84?
The AIDS advisory document was December 84, so you were moving on.
I'd started working at Charing Cross and Queen Mary's at the beginning of November 84. I do remember when I gave that evidence to the Lindsay Tribunal, I cross-checked with, I think in particular, I cross-checked with Sister Patricia Lilly, who was the clinical nurse specialist who had worked alongside Dr. Kernoff at that time. So that was where that fact came from. But I was then working at Queen Mary's, Roehampton.
Yes, I'm not suggesting that these were decisions for which you were responsible, Professor Lee. It's simply because they were matters that were looked at the time of the Lindsay Tribunal through your evidence. So the position, as I understand it from your Lindsay evidence, and it's really to ensure that this information is heard by others, there's a 3 to 6 month period in relation to patients receiving factor 8, where some would continue to receive unheated concentrates, some received heated concentrates on a phased basis. And in relation to factor 9, what you told the Lindsay Tribunal was that it was unheated NHS factor 9 until the beginning of May 1985, then alpha heated factor 9 for a short period of time, and then from July onwards, heated NHS factor 9. And that's likely to be correct, is it, on the basis that's what you told Lindsay?
So.
Want to ask you next about the arrangements that were made for the testing of patients for HIV, HTLV3, once a test became available. Your statement says the last thing that you did before you left in November 1984 was to take samples from all the patients and send them to Professor Tedder. As I understand it from what you've said elsewhere, Professor Lee, what was actually done was that the stored samples were used. Is that correct?
Yes.
And if we just look at the way in which you put it in the oral history project interview, it's THOM 601, please, Henry. And if we go to page 29, please. If we look down about 8 lines from the top, begins, and then towards the HIV virus was not identified until I think May or June of 84. We didn't have a test until the November of 84, and we had access in a research capacity. And I mean, now it's horrific what we did, but it was okay at that time. I can't even remember. We used gloves, but we actually decanted from our stored specimens because we had 600 patients we didn't know who was positive and who was negative. And we decanted the stuff into little test tubes and sent them down to Richard Tedder at the Middlesex Hospital for testing. So is this right, that as a matter of fact, patients at the Royal Free, all the patients at the Royal Free, were tested for HIV without their knowledge and consent?
Yes.
In terms of the numbers who were infected, who were HIV positive, you told us in your witness statement, and you told the Lindsay Tribunal, it was 111 patients. I've seen reference, Professor Lee, in some places to 112. Is that because there was a partner?
The 112 initially, this information was... I think I should just expand a bit here. Richard Tedder had a test in advance of there being a test available, and so the reliability of that test was not entirely sure. Dr. Kernoff had obviously must have had conversation with Richard Tedder, and he asked me to decant samples into test tubes, and I did that alongside Dr. Elizabeth Miller, who was going to take over my post. So I had no further involvement in that. I'm sorry, I've lost the thread. What did you ask me?
I'd asked you about the numbers who tested positive.
Yes, sorry, the 111 and 112.
Yes.
It was only much later that we realised that one of the 112th, if you like, was an individual who actually had HIV for other reasons, and he had never received clotting factor concentrate.
The majority of those who tested positive were those with severe haemophilia A. I think the figures you put in your statement, and which you gave the Lindsay Tribunal, were 101 patients who had severe haemophilia A, 7 who were mild or moderate, 1 haemophilia B, and a possible von Willebrand's. As I understand it, no children who had been treated solely at the Royal Free were HIV positive.
That's right.
And that is presumably because they had been treated solely with NHS concentrate.
Yes. And the one individual who'd been treated with factor 9 concentrate, it was unheated NHS concentrate that he had. And he acquired HIV for it.
That was the haemophilia B patient, and,
yes.
And that was in the course of the first part of 1985.
Yes, because there was a lag in time between the BPL heat treating factor 8 concentrate and factor 9. My memory was that, I may be wrong, but it may not have been until August of 85, but that's
I think there's certainly one place in the papers where you've said July of 1985.
And I have expanded on this in my statement, that it was because there's, and you know, this is picked up in Minucci's commentary, that we still didn't know for certain whether heating would fix it. It wasn't entirely clear. And Dr. Kernoff took the decision that the NHS donor pool at that stage was more likely to be safer than the American donor pool, and therefore he continued those factor 9 patients on NHS treatment. I mean, it was a wrong decision, but it was made with the right logic, I suppose, at the time.
You also told the Lindsay Tribunal that there were a few adults who'd been treated solely with NHS factor 8 and none of those were infected with HIV.
That's right.
Was there any particular feature of that, you may not be able to answer this, but was there any particular feature of that cohort of patients who'd only been treated with NHS factor 8? Was that just happenstance, or were there particular types of patients who only got NHS factor 8?
Well, I can specifically remember two of them, why they did it. You remember yesterday I talked about a carrier lady who had fulminant hepatitis from cryoprecipitate. And she was a very, she was very protective of her son, and she'd always insisted, although actually there wasn't necessarily a scientific reason at the time, but she had always insisted he had NHS product, and that was the way it was. And there was another patient who insisted on having it.
Is it right that there were children who had been treated elsewhere than the Royal Free, so treated, I think, specifically at Great Ormond Street Hospital, who had received commercial concentrates there, had then transferred their care to the Royal Free?
Yeah, I can't remember how many there were. I can remember specifically that there was a child whose parents had worked in the Middle East and he'd had concentrate, and so he was a child with infection. But I don't think, you see, the children there may have been children who'd been treated as children at the Royal. Is that what you're saying? The children who'd been treated as children at Great Ormond Street, who then came to the Royal Free because they'd had commercial. Yes.
It wasn't entirely clear from the Lindsay evidence whether that was the position or not.
Was, Professor Hardesty was the haematology professor at Great Ormond Street then, and they had used commercial concentrate, I think, but they came to us as adults. They didn't. We had our own children, and Great Ormond Street had their own children, and our children were treated with NHS concentrate.
Whose decision had it been to use the stored samples to send those off for testing without patients being told in advance? Would that have been Dr. Kernoff's decision? It would have been Dr. Kernoff's.
And I think it needs a bit of qualification, because there was a bit of concern about sort of public health risk and things as well, because although universal precautions became adopted gradually soon after that, the nurses were handling needles and doing treatments. The laboratory were handling the samples, and indeed the surgeons might be operating on these people, these patients. And so I think, although basically it was to find out who was infected, there was also that issue. There was also, I think, the issue that we had, I think, about 500 patients then, and we needed to focus our clinical care on people who were infected. I mean, I'm doing what I said. It's difficult to do. I'm reading Dr. Kernoff's decision-making process to do that.
You observed in the oral history project, in the passage that we've got on the screen, you said it's horrific what we did, but it was okay at that time. And in your statement, you say, in relation to this issue, the issue of samples having been tested without the patient's knowledge or consent, you say you abided by the relevant ethical principles as you understood them to be at the time. I'm conscious that this was not, on the evidence you've just given, your decision, it was Dr. Kernoff's decision, but can I just ask for your understanding of what the relevant ethical principles were at the time regarding issues of consent for testing?
Well, essentially there weren't really big issues of consent until HIV came along, and then we started taking consent for testing that. I went very thoroughly through your expert document on the ethics and consent, and it's a wonderful document, but I mean the bottom line is that until the Data Protection Act in 1998, which became law in 2000, taking samples or using stored samples of blood or specimens, if it was anonymous and it was used for audit or epidemiological reasons, there was no need. This is before. The Data Protection Act in 1998, which became law in 2000, states that you have to get ethical consent for a study, but you do not have to ask the individual patient's consent for testing stored serum or specimens. But it's recommended that you get, if it's anonymous, you don't have to get the patient's consent, but you should get ethical consent. This is in 2000. At this time, there wasn't any ethical issues around this or consent.
Okay. Well, I mean, we do have various materials which I think have been sent to you in advance, Professor Lee, which are BMA and Medical Defence Union materials really from the 1950s onwards. I can ask you about those if it would assist or if there's anything you want to say about them. Do you know whether any express consideration was given within the centre at the time to whether there was an ethical component to what you were proposing to do?
No.
As in, there was no express consideration, or you don't know?
No.
Sorry, forgive me, Professor Lee.
There are two questions.
Yes, it's my fault entirely. Was there any ethical consideration or discussion? Was there any discussion or consideration of the ethical dimensions of what was proposed?
No.
Okay. And then, as I understand it, the arrangements for telling patients the result was the responsibility of others within the centre, and you, by this time, were now back down to working only 1 day a week at the Royal Free.
I wasn't there. Can I go back to what I was doing or what I wasn't doing? I started at Queen Mary's in Charing Cross at the beginning of November, and I didn't start going back for a day a week. I think it was until 86.
Okay. So in any event, I won't ask you about that.
But I think I did. I mean, I sometimes feel it was very difficult, I'm sure, for those who had to give results. I never had to do it, ever.
So by the time you rejoined the centre as a consultant in full-time in 87, all the patients, as far as you're aware, had been told their diagnosis?
Yes, and the people concerned, I think, were this in my statement, were Dr. Ella Goldman, and I think she's making a statement for you, I imagine, and Mrs. Reva Miller, who's the family therapist, and I think the person who took over from me, Dr. Elizabeth Miller, I think they were the three people. I don't know whether Dr. Kernoff himself gave results, I don't know.
Okay. Work was undertaken to try and establish the date of seroconversion at a later stage. And if we have up on screen, Henry, please, WITN 0644083. This is a 1989 publication, A Natural History of HIV Infection in a Hemophiliac Cohort. And again, you are one of the authors of this. If we just look down the bottom of that page, we can see it says 112 anti-HIV positive patients were entered into the study using data from records and samples from the period 1st of December 1979 to the 30th of November 1988, and then you give various statistics in relation to that. If we go over to the next page, please, Henry. If we look first of all towards the bottom of the page under the heading Results, we can see there were 59 patients for whom a previously negative anti-HIV result was available. So that's doing a retrospective exercise, going back to the stored samples.
Yes,
and
I
testing the
think it
stored
might be
samples.
helpful the
table at the top.
to take you through the diagram
Yeah,
above.
top of the page, please, Henry.
This doesn't show 112 patients, and again, actually, that's a slight mistake. It should be 111. I was telling you about the von Willebrands who subsequently was found not to have had concentrate. This is looking at people for whom we had a specimen that was negative, and then we had a specimen that was positive. So each line represents a patient, and you see the seroconversion for the first patient was in 1979, and then gradually there's a transition over these years, and you see the last patient was the Hemophilia B patient I told you about, who's seroconverted in 1985. From the beginning of 1985, as we've already discussed, there was heated concentrate, so there were no more seroconversions. And I think what is really sad is that, well, if I look at the time that I started at the beginning of 83, and you draw a line up, most patients had actually been infected by then, and unwittingly we watched some people being moving into HIV positivity, being infected, but of course we didn't know. It's the epidemic of HIV and haemophilia is short because it ended with heating, and also in this country, well, actually, in this country, it tended to come over later in the general population, but that was when it emerged in the American population, donor population.
And just so that I can ensure I've correctly understood the table, Professor Lee, the open circle, as it were, or the white circle, represents the last negative.
That's right.
Result. The black circle represents the first positive result, and the line is a line, and it's any point between those 2 points where the individual may have seroconverted.
Yes.
And for the purposes of the analysis you do in the paper, certain assumptions are made. I don't use that word critically, about taking a median point.
Well,
Is that right?
It means the middle.
Yeah.
You take the time here and the time there, and you take the middle point. And I think the middle point was the beginning of 83. Yeah.
Do you know whether the information that table reveals about the time periods within which these 59 individuals would have seroconverted, was that information that was ever shared with the individual patients themselves?
I doubt whether it was. By the time this paper was written, the patients were on heat-treated concentrate, so we knew it was safe. And these data, we wouldn't have had early on. So at the time that the people were giving the test results, we wouldn't have had these data. They were. I mean, I think when they gave the test results, they had who was positive from Richard Tedder's results, but these data were assembled later.
No, I understand that this would have been information available only potentially as at 1989 when the analysis was done. My question, and it's a question that I've been asked by others, in fact, to inquire as to, was at that point in 1989 when for some patients, only some, you had a time period within which they'd seroconverted. Was that information given to them at that point?
I doubt whether it was done routinely. No, I don't. And to be perfectly honest, I don't know. I think one would have to refer back to a contemporaneous note that was made.
Can I turn then to the question of testing and diagnosis for hepatitis C? But before we look specifically at the hepatitis C testing arrangements in the Royal Free in 1990-1991, can I just ask you about the practice in relation to non-A, non-B hepatitis? You, 1986 you returned part-time, 1987 you become a full-time consultant at the Royal Free. Presumably, there were patients who the centre believed to have non-A, non-B hepatitis. Was that information, as far as you know, from your patient dealings, patient records, was that information, that diagnosis of shared with patients at the time?
Well, the particular patients that I can remember that I was testing for, I told you that it was the end or the beginning of 1983. It was the end of the study period. Certainly when I took blood from them, I discussed what we were doing and why we were doing it and what we understood. And before that, I imagine Dr. Kernoff must have done that. And certainly if you look back in the notes when we did reviews later on, I mean, we talked about what had been shown in their liver function tests and what we understood, but yes.
Your statement refers to then the process for testing for HCV once the hepatitis C test became available. We'll look at a couple of documents in a moment, but before we do that, what can you recall? You were a consultant at the centre by now, 1990, 1991. What can you recall about how testing for hepatitis C was undertaken at the centre?
Well, it was my responsibility to look after the patients with HIV and hepatitis C, and by 1990, I was the kind of more knowledgeable one, I suppose. So the liver unit and the virology unit had got an in-house test for antibody, I think. And then later they had what's called a PCR test for antigen. And we knew, the virus was identified in the world in 1989. And we had the test available, and therefore we tested our patients to see if they had antibody. By that stage, patients would have been regularly reviewed, and their liver function tests had been discussed with them, and if those who had abnormal ones, it would have been discussed. And I sent a letter of the results. I think we initially tested about 80. And I think you probably have the letter.
Yeah,
there.
we'll have a look at the document. It's BART 0000668. Can we go to the next page first, please, Henry? So, could we put both of this page and the next page on screen together? It's just easier to see the document as a whole. So we can see this is headed HCV policy document for the Haemophilia Centre, and if we look on the right-hand side, we can see it's authored by you. It's dated the 4th of May 1990. We can then, if we look in introduction, you talk about the agent having been identified, and then if we go on to the heading Studies at the Royal Free Haemophilia Centre, you say this: we've been able to study the longitudinal behaviour of antibody to HCV using the ortho-HCV antibody assay and testing stored sera from patients who developed non-A, non-B hepatitis following exposure to unheated pooled factor concentrates. All such patients have been found to be seropositive for anti-HCV. We have thus demonstrated reliability of the ortho-anti-HCV assay. In our haemophilic population, HCV accounts for the non-A, non-B hepatitis seen, and in the majority of patients, the antibody is long-lasting, may reflect virus replication, etc. Just pausing there, this would appear to suggest that by this time, this is the 4th of May 1990, at the Royal Free, all patients believed to have non-A, non-B hepatitis had been tested for HCV using the particular test here.
No, that's wrong. It may read as if that's the case. I think this was using the samples from the retrospective study that showed that a first exposure had 100% risk. And so we were able, because we had longitudinal samples of that, and we knew the incubation period from the transaminases, we were able to use those samples. This is from the 1985 paper on non-A, non-B. Those samples, we use those samples to test that antibody test. And
Okay, so just trying to understand, so is it only a subset of patients?
yes, at that stage, because I think the question was whether this was reliable or not.
And that testing was undertaken on the stored sera, so
Yes.
that you, whoever it was, took the sera from storage
Yes,
for this subset of patients.
it's the patients who are in the first
Yes,
exposure.
which we'll look
that
at.
table.
We'll look at that up this afternoon. But you tested them for their samples for hepatitis C using the new test that was now available. So for that cohort of patients, is this right, that that first test was undertaken without their knowledge and consent?
Yes.
If we then go to the previous page...
I would just go back without their knowledge or consent. Of course, all those patients will have been told that they, back in 78, 83, they will have been told at that stage that they had had non-A, non-B hepatitis. So they knew that. And every time they came for their review, they would be reminded of that.
So Brian,
Just let her answer, if you please.
that I think is an assumption you're making, because as you've rightly...
Sorry?
Is it fair to say that what you've just said, which is that patients between 1978 and 1983 would have been told they had non-A, non-B hepatitis, that's an assumption you're making because, of course, as you've as you've told us, you only came in at the end of January
but
1983.
it's okay. It's an assumption that Dr. Kernoff would have told them that.
Could we go to the first page of this document, which is the letter? So this is a letter dated the 4th of June 1990. And it's obviously a standard form letter, but we have seen it crop up in individual patient records from the statements that the inquiry has received. Dear Blank, I'm writing to tell you about the new anti-Hcv test. Many haemophiliacs who've been treated in the past with unheated clotting factor concentrates or other blood products have been exposed to the non-A, non-B hepatitis virus, so-called because it's unrelated to hepatitis A, unrelated to hepatitis B. One agent responsible for non-A, non-B has now been identified. We have a new test available which measures antibody to HCV, anti-Hcv, and shows past infection. Your anti-Hcv was positive on blank. Now, the way this letter might read, or might be said to read, is it's simultaneously telling the patient about the new test and telling them their result, which would suggest they hadn't been told in advance of the testing that the testing was going to take place.
Yes.
Is that what happened then for all patients? Was this the model that was adopted for all patients?
I think ultimately, yes. And I go back to what I said before, that the patients would have been regularly reviewed through all these years. And we had a review pro forma, and one of the sections that patients were asked about and discussed was hepatitis. So the transaminase results would be discussed through all those years. And as information emerged, it probably would have been more detailed information about what the nature of non-A, non-B was, as far as we knew it.
Do you think there's a difference between the process of telling a patient that what their liver function test results are, whether they have elevated transaminases and so on, and actually testing them for hepatitis C once the test was available?
Yes.
Is there any particular reason why patients were not called in and asked whether they consented to being tested for hepatitis C before the tests were undertaken?
I think it wasn't thought necessary at that stage. It wasn't. You see the last paragraph of this letter, that the idea was that it would be discussed at their next review, and if they wanted to come and discuss it, they were very welcome to earlier than that.
Was this the method by which patients were intended to be given their hepatitis C result? It was by letter?
At this stage, I think the original, the first batch, I had 80 patients to do this. It's the context of a busy department doing all sorts of other things. If we pulled up 80 patients at that stage, it would have been very difficult. And the reason for putting that last paragraph in is to encourage patients who wanted to come and discuss earlier. And the whole working of the centre also was that people could walk in if they wanted. They could phone up. They could phone directly to nurses, the consultant haemophilia nurses. So,
do you think, whether with the benefit of hindsight or otherwise, do you think that was the right way to tell patients that they had tested positive for hepatitis C, known to be a serious disease with long-term consequences?
Yes, because it had been discussed over many years about non-A, non-B transaminitis. So I do think so.
And the onus then was on the patient to make the appointment to come in and be given further information if they sought it?
Yes.
Can we go back to the...
And I can't exactly recall the number, but it was a handful that did that. Most patients discussed it at their next review appointment.
Can we go on to the second page again, Henry? Can we look at the paragraph below the paragraph we looked at previously? It begins, we have also demonstrated a 7% seropositivity rate in 30 female sexual partners of 30 anti-HIV and anti-Hcv positive haemophiliacs. In other studies, the seropositivity rate amongst sexual partners has been higher. It seems likely, therefore, that sexual transmission of HCV may occur. Just wanted to ask you about that first sentence. How was it that the centre had stored sera for the sexual partners of a number of its patients?
I think very early on there had been a concern that, because people were treating at home and sometimes families were it wasn't necessarily the patient, sometimes the other members of the family, like a wife, might be doing it. I think that's how that had been there. I think Dr. Eleanor Goldman had looked at this, because the other issue that is sort of slightly tied up about this was that hepatitis B itself, not A, non B, but hepatitis B was very, you could easily get it from people you were living with. And I have a feeling that there was a study to look and see whether family members had abnormal transaminases, but
And
there is a publication from this, I think.
the 30 female partners whose sera has obviously been tested, if one looks at this, would it be right to infer from this that their sera had been tested also without with them expressly being told that was happening?
I think it's very difficult to remember precisely. I think we did look at HIV seropositivity in partners, because obviously, it's very important. And of course, what we haven't talked about here at all is that everybody who got infected with HIV must have been infected with hepatitis C, either at the time that they got infected with HIV or before. And I think this may have been the blood samples from looking at whether spouses were infected with HIV. I can't remember.
That might be why you had the stored samples.
Yes, I think that was probably why. I can't actually remember. And that's.
But is it right to understand from this that as with the patients themselves, the samples were tested, and only after that the patients were informed of that fact? The partners were informed of that fact.
I think I would have to go back to the publication of the HIV in partners, because I think that's published by the time that was done, consent for HIV testing came in quite early. I mean, it's something that really moved consent for that I think in 85, and so those partners would have consented for the HIV test, and those specimens would have been stored, but the partners weren't asked, I don't think, for the anti-HCV. No.
So I note the time. Is this a convenient point to stop?
Yes, it is. So let's meet again then at 2:05. 2:05.